the new god of power, the new gods of power, a new god of power, the new goddess of power, the new goddesses of power, a new goddess of power, the old god of power, the old gods of power, a old god of power, the old goddess of power, the old goddesses of power, a old goddess of power, the greater god of power, the greater gods of power, a greater god of power, the greater goddess of power, the greater goddesses of power, a greater goddess of power, the lesser god of power, the lesser gods of power, a lesser god of power, the lesser goddess of power, the lesser goddesses of power, a lesser goddess of power, the greater spirit of power, the greater spirits of power, a greater spirit of power, the lesser spirit of power, the lesser spirits of power, a lesser spirit of power, the major god of power, the major gods of power, a major god of power, the major goddess of power, the major goddesses of power, a major goddess of power, the minor god of power, the minor gods of power, a minor god of power, the minor goddess of power, the minor goddesses of power, a minor goddess of power, the superior god of power, the superior gods of power, a superior god of power, the superior goddess of power, the superior goddesses of power, a superior goddess of power, the inferior god of power, the inferior gods of power, a inferior god of power, the inferior goddess of power, the inferior goddesses of power, a inferior goddess of power, the ancestor god of power, the ancestor gods of power, a ancestor god of power, the ancestor goddess of power, the ancestor goddesses of power, a ancestor goddess of power, the ascendant god of power, the ascendant gods of power, a ascendant god of power, the ascendant goddess of power, the ascendant goddesses of power, a ascendant goddess of power, the descendant god of power, the descendant gods of power, a descendant god of power, the descendant goddess of power, the descendant goddesses of power, a descendant goddess of power, the transcendent god of power, the transcendent gods of power, a transcendent god of power, the transcendent goddess of power, the transcendent goddesses of power, a transcendent goddess of power, the future god of power, the future gods of power, a future god of power, the future goddess of power, the future goddesses of power, a future goddess of power, the present god of power, the present gods of power, a present god of power, the present goddess of power, the present goddesses of power, a present goddess of power, the past god of power, the past gods of power, a past god of power, the past goddess of power, the past goddesses of power, a past goddess of power, the god of power, the gods of power, a god of power, the goddess of power, the goddesses of power, a goddess of power, the half-god of power, the half-gods of power, a half-god of power, the half-goddess of power, the half-goddesses of power, a half-goddess of power, the vessel of power, the vessels of power, a vessel of power, the person of power, the persons of power, a person of power, the persona of power, the personas of power, a persona of power, the personage of power, the personages of power, a personage of power, the personality of power, the personalities of power, a personality of power, the personification of power, the personifications of power, a personification of power, the image of power, the images of power, a image of power, the imagination of power, the imaginations of power, a imagination of power, the belief of power, the beliefs of power, a belief of power, the thought of power, the thoughts of power, a thought of power, the word of power, the words of power, a word of power, the action of power, the actions of power, a action of power, the reaction of power, the reactions of power, a reaction of power, the situation of power, the situations of power, a situation of power, the circumstance of power, the circumstances of power, a circumstance of power, the relationship of power, the relationships of power, a relationship of power, the number of power, the numbers of power, a number of power, the formula of power, the formulas of power, a formula of power, the equation of power, the equations of power, a equation of power, the symbol of power, the symbols of power, a symbol of power, the color of power, the colors of power, a color of power, the thing of power, the things of power, a thing of power, the way of power, the ways of power, a way of power, the place of power, the places of power, a place of power, the time of power, the times of power, a time of power, the event of power, the events of power, a event of power, the result of power, the results of power, a result of power, the crown of power, the crowns of power, a crown of power, the power king, the power kings, the power kingdom, the power kingdoms, the power king's subject, the power king's subjects, the power king's dominion, the power king's dominions, the kingdom of power, the kingdoms of power, a kingdom of power, the power queen, the power queens, the power queendom, the power queendoms, the power queen's subject, the power queen's subjects, the power queen's dominion, the power queen's dominions, the queendom of power, the queendoms of power, a queendom of power, the power prince, the power princes, the power princedom, the power princedoms, the power prince's subject, the power prince's subjects, the power prince's dominion, the power prince's dominions, the princedom of power, the princedoms of power, a princedom of power, the power princess, the power princesses, the power princessdom, the power princessdoms, the power princess's subject, the power princess's subjects, the power princess's dominion, the power princess's dominions, the princessdom of power, the princessdoms of power, a princessdom of power, the leader of power, the leaders of power, a leader of power, the follower of power, the followers of power, a follower of power, the natural form of power, the natural forms of power, a natural form of power, the supernatural form of power, the supernatural forms of power, a supernatural form of power, the temporal form of power, the temporal forms of power, a temporal form of power, the spiritual form of power, the spiritual forms of power, a spiritual form of power, the age of power, the ages of power, a age of power, the awakening of power, the awakenings of power, a awakening of power, the realm of power, the realms of power, a realm of power, the dimension of power, the dimensions of power, a dimension of power, the purpose of power, the purposes of power, a purpose of power, the manifestation of power, the manifestations of power, a manifestation of power, the source of power, the sources of power, a source of power, the origin of power, the origins of power, a origin of power, the ancestor of power, the ancestors of power, a ancestor of power, the descendant of power, the descendants of power, a descendant of power, the lineage of power, the lineages of power, a lineage of power, the forefather of power, the forefathers of power, a forefather of power, the foremother of power, the foremothers of power, a foremother of power, the mask of power, the masks of power, a mask of power, the armor of power, the armors of power, a armor of power, the champion of power, the champions of power, a champion of power, the elemental art of power, the elemental arts of power, a elemental art of power, the elemental science of power, the elemental sciences of power, a elemental science of power, the elemental principle of power, the elemental principles of power, a elemental principle of power, the agent of power, the agents of power, a agent of power, the agency of power, the agencies of power, a agency of power, the amplifier of power, the amplifiers of power, a amplifier of power, the amplification of power, the amplifications of power, a amplification of power, the aura of power, the auras of power, a aura of power, the power of power, the powers of power, a power of power, the authority of power, the authorities of power, a authority of power, the might of power, the mights of power, a might of power, the dominion of power, the dominions of power, a dominion of power, the melody of power, the melodies of power, a melody of power, the rhythm of power, the rhythms of power, a rhythm of power, the dance of power, the dances of power, a dance of power, the music of power, the musics of power, a music of power, the spirit of power, the spirits of power, a spirit of power, the people of power, the peoples of power, a people of power, the mark of power, the marks of power, a mark of power, the promise of power, the promises of power, a promise of power, the vision of power, the visions of power, a vision of power, the language of power, the languages of power, a language of power, the sound of power, the sounds of power, a sound of power, the secret of power, the secrets of power, a secret of power, the knowledge of power, the knowledges of power, a knowledge of power, the understanding of power, the understandings of power, a understanding of power, the wisdom of power, the wisdoms of power, a wisdom of power, the revelation of power, the revelations of power, a revelation of power, the strength of power, the strengths of power, a strength of power, the fortress of power, the fortresses of power, a fortress of power, the city of power, the cities of power, a city of power, the nation of power, the nations of power, a nation of power, the civilization of power, the civilizations of power, a civilization of power,